Well, let's get started. Welcome to Privacy 101. I used to be an 8th grade science teacher. And I think you're about to see some of that science teacher come out because I have an activity for you. John, can you confirm that the sound is okay for online? Okay, perfect. All right, so folks who are online, I've got this, actually, I'm gonna hold off on that, handing that out, but I do have a virtual handout for you. Okay. So let's talk through your learning intentions. This is what I'm hoping that you will get out of this session today. First is that you will understand the basics of FERPA, the Student Data Protection Act, and what we call Utah PPRA. And then the second is that you'll understand and be able to identify the overlap between these privacy laws and privacy principles. All right, so let's dive in. We're going to take an approach today of tying the laws that we talk about to the principles, privacy principles. So for those of you who are online, I encourage you to open this slideshow or just open this link straight from the resources doc. And John, maybe you could throw a link to the chat if possible. So this privacy principles handout is something that we put together to sort of encapsulate the principles that sort of identify privacy best practices. I'd like you guys to please take a few minutes to read through it. And I want you to look at the document through the lens of, does anything stand out to you? Is there anything surprising to you? Anything interesting to you? And I'll give you about 4 minutes to read through that. And then I'll ask for volunteers to share. This same activity goes for you online. So if you want to open up the digital copy of this handout, we're going to take 3 minutes to read through it. Okay, ready, set, go.
And for those of you online, currently I've opened up the document and you can take a look at all of the 10 principles that Kate was talking about.
Thanks, John.
I can put this. Oh, boy.
Okay, do we need more time or are people done? Give 30 seconds to wrap up. Actually, 20 seconds. Okay, great. So let's share out. If you are joining virtually, I invite you to share out in the chat. And then John, if you see anything that you want to verbalize, feel free to do that. For those of you in the room, my question for you is anything that stands out to you in that document, any questions you have, things you like, things that don't make sense, anything?
Stands out. Use only what you need, collect only what you need, store only as long as you need to, and full disclosure.
Excellent, thank you. So just to repeat, use only what you need, collect only what you need, Store it only as long as you need it. And then what was your last thing that you said?
And full disclosure.
Full disclosure. Okay, great. Okay, excellent. Thanks. Any other thoughts that stand out to you from that handout?
There are no comments in the chat.
No comments in chat.
Accountability. Take ownership.
Accountability, taking ownership. Yes, that's one of my personal favorites and one that can be really uncomfortable. But I think it's important. Anything else in the chat or in person? Okay, great. So here's our plan for today. We're going to be, so keep this handout in front of you. Oh, John, go ahead.
Up 3 and 8 tie into the data part of the principle of least privilege.
3 and 8. So confidentiality and
Purpose
limitation. Yes. Okay. So principle of least privilege, for those of you who don't know, is the concept that staff should have access only to the amount of information they need to do their job. Or more technically, they should only have access in a system to the functionality that they need to do their job. So like your student information systems in your schools probably have different segmentation for the types of users that are using it. Yeah, that's a great observation. Thank you to Mystery
Robert Davidson.
Thank you, Robert Davidson. All right, great. So our plan for today is we're going to keep this handy. These are the principles that govern us in our data privacy, in the data privacy world, but they're not laws. We are going to talk about the laws today, but then all throughout, as we talk about the laws, we'll kind of return to these privacy principles and ask ourselves, in the laws that we just talked about, what privacy principles apply? My recommendation for you, well, let me say this. Myself and my team receive a lot of questions about privacy questions, which we love and invite and continue to invite. The answer, if any of you have asked us a question, you might know that sometimes our answer is twofold. Our answer is, this is what the law says, but you might also want to consider these best practices. So if I were in your shoes as a privacy individual, I think living in this space, these principles space, in a way almost lets you kind of relax and step away from the laws. Because if you're abiding by these principles, then you're going to have the laws covered plus more. So that's one of the reasons I was so excited to have this handout. Is if I were in your shoes, I would tack this guy up on my cork board next to my desk and just operate using these principles. But it is important to know the law too. So that's what we'll get into today. All right. So there are 4 laws that apply to education in Utah, data privacy laws. The first is FERPA. So FERPA is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. This is an old law. This one was passed in 1974. It just turned 50 years old in August. And it's a federal law. So it was passed in US Congress. Next, we have the Student Data Protection Act, which we sometimes call the SDPA. This is a Utah-specific law, and it's quite new. It was passed originally in 2017 and has been amended almost every year since then. Interestingly, this is the law that there was some funding associated with this law, and it is the funding that funds my position and John's position and other people on my team. Third is this is a kind of a combination of 2 laws. The Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment is a federal law, but it has a Utah version that is more specific. So we usually just focus on the Utah one. Because it's a Utah version of this federal one, we call it sometimes Utah PPRA. And it was passed in 1995. And finally, the Government Data Privacy Act, or GDPA. It's not education specific, unlike these others, but it does apply to education. So you don't see conversations in this law about student data privacy in particular, but you do hear language about privacy in general. It's Utah specific, and it just passed in this last legislative session. So this is brand new as of February. And we're going to focus only on these first 3. This 4th one is so new. This is actually the one Jeremy's talking about next door, but you can expect to continue hearing trainings from us on that law. Okay, so let's dive into FERPA. FERPA is big and complex, but so today, again, this is a 101. So we're going to focus just on parent rights, FERPA exceptions, and in particular, the school official exception and the directory information exception. All right. Parental rights. Oh, and then John, so I've got these polls. There are 4
Oh, we have a
polls
question.
built in. Oh, yes, please.
With the risk in all caps of the the abolishment of the Federal Department of Education, would the states like ours look to adopt a state version of FERPA, or will PPRA cover for FERPA?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've thought a lot about this and what would happen there. My guess is that FERPA is so fundamental to education. I don't see a world where legislators or parents would want those kind of privacy protections to go away. So I think either the law would remain in place, and it's just that the US Department of Education would not be the one supervising it, but rather the state level would need to supervise the law. Because right now, the federal government is the one that investigates complaints. So if the Department of Ed went away, that might fall down to our level at the state. It's a good question, and one that is definitely going to be interesting to follow.
Thank you, Herbert.
Yeah. All right. So the F in FERPA is not federal. Sometimes people think it's the federal education rights. It's family. So even we might not think about this, but first and foremost, FERPA is an access law, and it's all focused on parents having access to their kids' records. So there are 4 rights that are granted to parents under FERPA. The first is the right to inspect and review their students' education records. So if a parent comes and asks you, hey, I want to see my students' assessment scores, the school is obligated to provide that to them. The second, and I'll mention that access needs to be granted within 45 days. The second parent right that's afforded to parents is the right to request amendment of records if the record is misleading or inaccurate. So this doesn't mean that a parent could come and say, my kid got a B, but I want you to change it to an A minus. It's not that. It's saying, hey, I think you made a mistake. Like you left a math credit off of my child's transcript. I'm requesting that you amend that. That's kind of the example here. Third is the right to disclose. So parents have the right to grant consent before sharing certain data. There are a few exceptions to this, but this is the general idea, is that parents should have the ability to give consent or not give consent. And finally, they have the right to file a complaint, which kind of came up just a second ago, with the US Department of Education if they feel like their FERPA rights have been violated. Okay, people, it is time to do the activity that I've been so excited about. Again, science teacher.
Those of you that are not here, this is an indictment on you because you don't get to play
Okay,
with.
so you've got a little bag that has a little sign for each of the privacy principles we just talked about. I'm going to ask you to open your bag, dump out your privacy principles. And we just talked about the 4 FERPA rights that parents have. I want you to find any of these privacy principles that apply. And when you're ready, just hold them up so I can see. Those of you who are online, John is going to open up poll number 1.
It's open.
So you can select answer on the poll.
Which privacy principles are relevant to FERPA parental rights?
Yes.
We have 10 different choices that are aligned with the document that we're talking about.
I cannot stop smiling. I'm so happy about this activity. Okay, got a
For reference,
few.
I've put the document back up on the screen.
Thanks, John.
Okay, we have some answers coming in. We've got about 10% of respondents. Again, the question is, which privacy principles are relevant to FERPA parental rights? Got about 23% of participants.
Okay.
Ooh, 28. And the folks here in person are holding up cute little straws
They
with
are so
color-coded numbers.
Yeah, me too. All right, I'm going to
You're in
start.
50%. Come on.
Okay, great. I'm going to start stating some observations that I'm seeing here in the room. I see quite a few of you have consent selected, which I think makes a lot of sense. That's one of the rights afforded under FERPA. Another theme I'm seeing is access and accuracy. One that I'm seeing also held up by a few of you is accountability, which I thought was really interesting. Does anyone want to speak to that? Why you selected accountability as a relevant privacy principle here? Yes, please.
So that meant.
Exactly. Thank you. So she said, if you're amending something, then you're acknowledging that you've made a mistake and you're taking accountability for it. Love it. Great. John, any themes that you're seeing online?
So I'm going to end the poll here in just a second, but currently of the 21 respondents, the three highest ones are 1, access and accuracy, 4, consent, and 10, transparency.
Transparency. That's another one that, great. Okay, excellent. Fun activity, am I right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, let's move on to our next topic, which is still about FERPA, but now we're going to dive into the world of FERPA exceptions. So this is how I describe FERPA exceptions. FERPA in general says, it starts from a place of saying, hey, if you want to share a student's data with anyone ever, you have to get parent consent, no battle. But then the law goes on to say, but actually there are some exceptions. And then actually there are a bunch of them. There are like 18 exceptions to that rule. So again, when I say a FERPA exception, what I mean is it's an exception to the rule that you always have to get parent consent first. So a FERPA exception means an exception to the rule for getting parent consent. Okay, so we're going to dive into the two most commonly used FERPA exceptions. Again, an exception to the rule that you have to get consent before sharing. The school official exception is, I distinctly remember the first time I started talking about a school official, and my mind thought, to me, that term sounded like maybe like a police officer or like a student resource officer or something. I think the title can be a little bit confusing. It is not that at all. A school official just means someone who is typically an employee of the school or district and someone who has a legitimate educational interest in student records. The most common example of this, teachers. So these are people who need information about kids to do their job. Can you imagine if every teacher had to get a consent form before learning every piece of information about a student? FERPA recognizes that's not feasible. People need information to educate a child. And the school official exception allows those employees to have access to that information. Now, would a school administrator need the same information as a paraeducator? No. So again, actually, I almost just spoiled our poll. So when it comes time to do our poll, you might consider that the goal is to provide only access to the information that the employee has a legitimate educational interest in. Now, FERPA, the school official exception, also extends beyond traditional school employees, and it also includes individuals or companies with whom the school has outsourced work that the school would otherwise provide. Volunteers are a good example of this. They're not a school employee, but they do have the ability to have access to certain student information because they're doing a service the school would otherwise do. And then a really big one is ed tech apps. So most of you have a student information system that you did not design. It's not designed in-house. You're sharing data with a student information system because that student information system is providing a service for you that your school would otherwise provide probably on paper. Other examples of this can be just other educational technology apps like Nearpod, for example. You're permitted to share data with Nearpod because Nearpod is providing an instructional service that the school would otherwise provide. Okay, any questions on this, either in person or online? All right, so time for poll number 2. Go ahead and select any of the privacy principles that relate to the school official exception. And John's going to open poll number 2.
And as that's going, we have a clarification question. What about other schools requesting student records, but the child is not enrolled with that other school?
I think I need more context about, oh, sorry, getting echoey. I think we need more context about the purpose for the request.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, you're finding the privacy principles that apply to the school official exception. I have to say, this reminds me a little bit of like a paper, like flower bouquet.
We got about 23% so far.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to start calling out some themes I'm seeing in the room here. Confidentiality is one that I'm seeing amongst a bunch of folks. Anyone want to speak to that, why you selected confidentiality?
Well, again, we're talking about people who only need access to the data for their job, and so the level of access they need differs. So again, it's kind of that role-based access.
Bingo. Yes, love it. Personally, I think that's the principle that most clearly applies here, in my opinion. Anyone else have others that they want to share? John, are you seeing any trends online?
So of our 47% of folks, I would say our top 3 are number 3, confidentiality. Number 5, data minimization, and purpose limitation number 8.
Excellent. Oh, those are great. Yeah. Did any of you have purpose limitation as well? Excellent. Great. Very good. Okay. How are we doing? Are we having great fun with this activity? And aside from having great fun, I'm hopefully it's helping you learn and absorb the principles. Okay, great. All right. So on to our next FERPA exception. This is one of the 2 most common. The directory information exception. Now, I'll just say up front that there are very strong misunderstandings about this exception. So whether you're coming at this new or you're already have an idea, I invite you to just sort of like put on your intellectual humility hat because it might not be what you think it is. The directory information exception is an exception that allows a school to identify certain types of information as, quote, directory information. These are supposed to be pieces of information that are generally not going to be harmful to a student if they are disclosed. So here are some examples. The student's name, address, phone number, date and place of birth. You might, if you're like me, you might look at this and say, well, some parents might not think that that's dangerous to disclose, but some parents might think that it is harmful to disclose. I'm seeing some nodding heads in the room. So this is where one of the great misconceptions comes with directory information. This is true that a school can designate what it wants to consider directory information, but it's really important that parents are given the right to opt out. So common uses of the directory information exception are sort of like publication options. So if there were no directory information exception, then it would not be appropriate to print like a playbill for a school play. Because whoops, you just shared all the names of the kids in the play to the general public, and that's not allowed. So the directory information exception was created to allow for some positive publications of students. It's also what allows, it's one of the reasons that you're allowed to post like sports rosters and that kind of thing. But it's very important that parents are always given the right to opt out. This usually happens at the beginning of the school year. Now, you remember I said there's lots of misconceptions. One of the misconceptions is that when someone makes a request for directory information, that the school needs to fork over all the information. First of all, that's not true. You don't have to. The ability to share directory information is at the discretion of the school or district. There's no requirement to share it. And second of all, it's absolutely critical to remove the names and information of students who have been opted out. Another item to keep it, also, sorry, I kind of skipped over this one earlier, but it's also really important to keep in mind that not all schools consider the same information directory information. This is defined in your directory information notice that goes out to parents. It's probably part of your registration process. Yes, and then just to reiterate that when you are providing or sharing directory information, for example, in a playbill, that you need to remove the names of students who have been opted out. And finally, make sure that you're not tacking on other information to that directory information. So if someone contacts you and is like, hey, I want to know the names of all your students who are participating in this special ed program. They're asking for names, yes, but you've also basically told them that they're participating in a special ed program, so that's not appropriate. Any questions about the directory information exception? Okay, anything online, John?
We just had some clarification about the question before, but maybe we'll just come back around to that.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. All right, we don't have a poll for this one. I just want to note, as I mentioned earlier, there are a whole bunch of other exceptions. Again, an exception to the rule that you need to get parent consent first. These are all exceptions that allow a school or district to share student information for certain purposes, and it's allowable under FERPA even if they don't have parent consent. One of those is the audit evaluation exception. That's the exception that allows you to share information with us at the State Board of Education, for example. But we won't get into those. I just wanted to make you aware that there's a whole bunch of others. All right. Student Data Protection Act. Are we ready? Brand new law. We went through FERPA. Now we're on to the Student Data Protection Act, which is a Utah law. Again, it's a pretty big law, so we're not going to go through everything. But we are going to talk about what a data manager is, the metadata dictionary requirement, and a little bit of information about working with vendors. Are any of you in this room designated data managers? 2 of you. Anyone not sure? Okay. Any indication online of who's a...
We have 40 folks online. We've got some thumbs up here.
Okay.
I would assume that we have a overwhelming.
Okay, great. So in the Student Data Protection Act, I actually think this is kind of cool. So this idea of a designated data manager didn't just come out of nowhere. It's in the law. So those of you who are data managers, you are filling your legal requirement for your district or charter school, which I think is kind of exciting. Some of your responsibilities as a data manager are to act as the point of contact for USBE. So you might receive communication from us on a pretty regular basis. The second responsibility, and this is one that many of you might be really familiar with, is completing the privacy compliance review each year. Any of you involved in that at all? Okay, so this is completed every year. You get requests from Nicole Sanchez down the hall to send or to fill out a survey that sort of has certain requirements that you submit to us. And then if there's anything found to be missing, then you're required to fix that and then resubmit. And finally, this part is the most vague, but also the most powerful, in my opinion. So the data manager is the person who sort of oversees privacy practices in the school and in the school and district. This includes making sure that you have the right policies and notices in place, making sure that staff are getting privacy and security training. App vetting is a really big one, which we'll talk about momentarily. And then just generally kind of building a culture of privacy and being the go-to person for privacy and security. All right, next, the metadata dictionary. The metadata dictionary, I will first and foremost say, I think the name is not a great name. When the law was first written, I think it more accurately described a traditional metadata dictionary, but it's changed over time. So if you are like, what, Katie, why is it called that? You're not alone. It's kind of a weird name. But basically, the metadata dictionary is a public-facing listing of all of the places where you share student data. A lot of the time, this is going to include, in most schools and districts, this is basically a list of ed tech apps with a few other things tucked in there, like you share with the State Board of Education. That should be listed on your metadata dictionary. And for each of those items that's listed, you need to also indicate the purpose and the justification and the FERPA exception that makes it allowable to share that information. I will note that for a lot of schools and districts, this also serves as like a listing of approved applications. Does that apply to any of you in the room? Okay, great. But I will note that ultimately, or originally, the goal was to provide a transparency opportunity for parents so that the parents could see what was going on in the school. And also just to like make sure that schools weren't sharing willy-nilly. Okay, so time for our third poll. Go ahead and pull out your flower things and identify any of the privacy principles that apply to the metadata dictionary requirement. Again, a public listing of all the places where you share student data. John, what time are we? Is it 10 after? Pretty sure it's 10 after, 50 minutes. Okay. Oh, you've got a whole bundle.
And did you do this activity with your eighth graders?
No, but I did a lot of this kind of thing where it's manipulatives and show me what you think about this. This is so fun. Putting these together took me back. Yeah.
We have about 50% responses thus far.
Excellent.
And number 10, number 10,
10.
transparency is top on the list with number 7, lawfulness.
Great. Yes, I would argue lawfulness could apply to any of
And
these.
coming
Really.
in, transparency is a 73%. That's far and away. Then we've got accountability, number 3, and then access and accuracy and consent are kind of boxing it out a little bit.
Okay, excellent. Great. Yeah, I think transparency to me is the one that stands out the most. This is a way to be transparent with the public. I also thought it was really interesting to see that, let's see, I saw security. Did I say security on some of these? Yeah, does anyone want to speak to that? Why you selected security protections? Is that what it's called? I can't remember.
Yeah. You want to make sure you're only sharing the data as it's in your metadata dictionary.
Yes, great. Yes. So that to repeat for those of you online, you want to make sure you're sharing only the data as described in your metadata dictionary. Okay, excellent. Thanks, you guys. Great bouquets you've put together here in person. Yeah. All
We
right.
have confirmation online that we are going until 10:10.
Okay, delightful. Thank you. All right, again, with the Student Data Protection Act, here's another requirement. The Student Data Protection Act has some, well, let me put it this way. There's a big section of the Student Data Protection Act that basically says, hey, if you want to share data with a third-party contractor, which is often an ed tech vendor, then you need to make sure that you, district or charter school, you need to make sure that you have language in your contract that binds them to certain obligations. One of them is that they have to promise to not sell the data. They have to promise to not use it for purposes outside fulfilling their contract requirements. They have to promise that they're going to allow you to audit them if you want to. These are some examples. So that requirement is in place in the law. Well, there are two primary ways that you can meet that requirement. So typically, you as a district or charter school are not going to, well, let me say it this way. At the State Board of Education, Utah State Board of Education, at UEN, or at the STEM Action Center, we have sort of the bargaining power that we take some of those requirements and we shove them into our contract with the vendor. And then they sign the contract and they agree to all this stuff. It's how much we're going to pay them, et cetera, but it's also these privacy protections. At a district or charter school, it's less common to have a standalone contract. And so we meaning lots of people, not just Utah people, but we created for you a data privacy agreement that you can use to supplement a contract. Or sometimes you won't even have a formal contract. Sometimes you're using a product that's free, for example, and you're not signing it to pay for something, but a data privacy agreement acts as the contract to bind that company to those privacy protections that are required by the law. Is this making any sense? Okay, so basically the idea is if you sign on to a contract that is signed by USBE, UEN, or the STEM Action Center, you can rest assured that we've put that contract language in place. If that's not the case, then it's your duty to make sure that you have what is called a DPA in place, a data privacy agreement, so that the vendor is bound to that same contract language. Does anyone have any questions about this one, either in person or online? Okay, great. I don't have a poll set up for this one, but let's just do a quick. So people online, you can just type in the chat, I guess, because we don't have a poll set up, but I'm curious to see people like what privacy principles you think apply to this one. It's, in my opinion, a little bit less obvious. We'll just do a quick round.
How does the Student Data Protection Act and working with vendors apply to the list that we see here, 1 through 10?
Okay, we've got a whole bundle of them. I'm seeing security protections. I'm seeing purpose limitation. I'm seeing lawfulness. Yes, I very much agree. So a data privacy agreement is kind of, or the contract language is kind of an opportunity to force the vendor to commit to basically all 10 privacy principles, right? So it's not surprising to me to see that you've got a whole bunch selected. Okay, great. All right, now we're on to our third and final law, Utah PPRA. Again, this is the Utah version of the Federal Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. This one is still a privacy law, but it's sort of like a different angle at privacy. So we're going to talk about protected topics and other student surveys. All right, so this is what the law says. The law protects or prevents schools and districts from collecting information from students on certain types of topics. So the idea is we don't want students to come to school and be asked questions about very sensitive things without the parent knowing and giving consent first. Those very sensitive things, those protected topics are these. So before you ask a student about their political affiliation or the political affiliation of their family members, you got to get parent consent. Before you ask a student about their sexual orientation, behavior, attitudes, or gender identity, or the sexual orientation of their parents or family, you have to get parent consent. Another example is before you ask a student about their or their family's religious practices or beliefs. So you can see how this law kind of ensures that students aren't put in a vulnerable position where they feel the obligation to disclose what's generally considered to be pretty private or sensitive information. All right, there was also, have any of you guys heard of the survey bill? The new survey law? Okay. There was so this law already existed, but it was amended this last year in January and February to be a little bit more expansive. So in addition to just getting parent consent for those protected topic type surveys, the legislature said, hey, we also want to protect against other types of surveys, even if they don't contain questions on those protected topics. And the legislature specifically called out 3 types of surveys that you need to get parent consent for first. The first is surveys related to an early warning system. Do any of you use Panorama or another type of early warning system? Okay, so many early warning systems have a functionality that you can use that's sort of like a social emotional learning survey. You're not required to use it, but you can. And if you choose to use that survey, then you need to get parent consent at the time of registration. So you have to be prepared at the beginning of the school year, basically, to get consent for that. The second type of survey is surveys that contain social emotional learning questions. This one's tricky because that's quite vague. We get a lot of questions. What do we mean by social emotional learning? And sadly, the answer, happily, the answer is that that's going to be up to you and your district and charter school to answer that question in your own policy. And finally, if you administer the USBE school climate survey, you have to get parent consent for that at the time of registration. Okay. When you get parent consent, you have to give a really thorough notice so that the parent knows what they're giving consent for. And that includes giving them the exact questions that will be found on the survey and telling them other information like how the data will be used and who will have access to it. Okay, any questions or comments about this bad boy? All right, let's do poll number 4. And so those of you online, or in person, go ahead and get your little stick things out and identify the privacy principles that relate this to Utah PPRA that we just talked about.
Ooh, consent is flying up the chain. Transparency. There are clear 1s and 2s, but number 3 is kind of floating around. Not that there is a specific number 3, but
it's up.
I mean, there are no right answers. And thus far, this is our most heavily participated in poll.
Oh, delightful. Okay, good. All right, I'm seeing lots of consent, lots of transparency. Great.
4 and 10, right? 10-4.
Yeah. I'm also seeing, let's see, I saw a couple that you had that I thought were interesting. Oh, data minimization. I hadn't thought of it through that angle, but yeah, if you're being really cautious about what's included in your survey, then you are simultaneously minimizing the amount of data that you're collecting.
And that's the one that scores the lowest.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Let's see what else we've got. Consent accountability.
Oops.
Great. Security protections. Excellent. All right. Great job, you guys.
Yep. 4, 10. And then I would say our number 3 is lawfulness.
Lawfulness. Thank you. I haven't really been calling that one out because it feels, I think I'm just now realizing that I've been minimizing that, but it's really important, right? In fact, I will tell you the first round of making this handout, I had them in order, not alphabetically, and I had lawfulness at the bottom. And my team rightfully was like, do you really want lawfulness at the bottom? Like, I was like, oh yeah, good point. All right, so to close, we're just gonna wrap up with, I'm gonna point you to some resources you can use, whether you're already in the privacy space or brand new. Also, for those of you who are a new data manager or know a new data manager, we've got a checklist for you that you can follow. and then also some contact info. So okay, it was just a little delayed. All right, so this is a robust list of resources. We've got a folder that has documents and instructions on obtaining data privacy agreements. The metadata dictionary instructions document is a very robust resource, especially if you're just getting started on your metadata dictionary, which, to be honest, is less relevant now than it used to be. Most people have got a really good start on their metadata dictionary, but the resource exists nonetheless. This Canvas course is probably the resource I would most strongly point you to. It's Canvas course, yes, but there's no sign-in required. It's more operating as like a web page. And there's lots of good stuff that John puts on there. The USPA application menu also helps with app vetting because it helps you to see at a glance whether other people have signed a DPA with a product, and then it helps you determine if you can subscribe to that. We have a YouTube channel that we're very proud of, which is, among other things, where this session will be posted, the recording of this session. We've got our website on the Utah State Board of Education webpage. And finally, there is a data privacy course that's intended for educators, but it's also a great resource if you just want to take it to learn more about data privacy, and there's a link for that there.
Or to pull it out for a faculty meeting.
Yeah.
Or some sort of professional development window.
Yes, so were you able to get the resources document open?
Sure. This one?
Yeah, the one that has the agenda in it? Yes, thank you. And if you're like, hey, Katie, I remember that, shoot us an email. We can point you to whatever you need. If you're a new data manager, these are your kind of checklist of getting started, but this applies to anyone who wants to learn more. So we have a newsletter. Are any of you subscribed to the newsletter that we send out? Okay, great. It's, I think, really great. And you only get it once a month, so it's not too overwhelming. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to sign up for that newsletter. There's also some listservs. Listservs are nice because it allows you to communicate two-way. So a newsletter is really just one way. It's us giving you information. But a listserv is a great opportunity to ask questions of your peers, and then they can respond. We have a newly formed K-12 privacy listserv that's already been used really heavily, especially surrounding data privacy agreements. So we encourage you to sign up for any or all of those. Again, there's the data manager course. There's the educator course. These are the same as the previous slide. And then finally, we just encourage you to continue prioritizing it. I invite you to attend. All right. And then while I am the one who gave the presentation today, I'm not the one who typically does most of the support for district and charter school folks. I'm always happy to help, but those support tasks are generally handled by John here, Nicole Sanchez on my team, and Jeremy Zabriskie on my team. So you can reach out to any of them directly or at our privacy@schools.utah.gov email, which then goes to all of us.